Right now, you have blacks that are comfortable living off the teat of the government.
That's
When
right.
Obama was voted in, there's several videos out there of black people saying we're going to get free stuff now.
Right.
Right now, you can see video after video after video of blacks not only during riots where I was in Moore, Oklahoma back in, I think it was 2013 when they had a big tornado hit. And I just happened to be there, and I was visiting Tulsa, Oklahoma, which we'll get into that too, because Tyreek spoke about that. But I was visiting there because I wanted to see Black Wall Street. As I was there, I noticed that whatever Black Wall Street was, there's not much remnants of it left. Now, blacks have Langston Hughes College there, and if they wanted to preserve what was there, they could have. But for some reason, it's not. It's very minimal. But I look at what the Jews do with the Holocaust. Not only do they have a Holocaust museum in LA, they had one in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was ironic. They have them all over. So they make sure you understand what happened to them, and they preserve their own heritage, history, what you're talking about, heritage.
Yes.
But the blacks aren't. So we're asking white people to observe our history while we don't observe it. We begged white people for Martin Luther King holiday. Jews have, it's not Rosh Hashanah. What is that? Yom Kippur. They take off. They won't even work. They'll be in the NBA, NFL, whatever. They won't go to work. Blacks, literally on Martin Luther King holiday, they don't do anything. They don't have anything planned. And if whites weren't putting it together, nothing would be put together. So if you didn't see a parade or you didn't see something on television from whites, blacks wouldn't do anything. I have to then ask, though, in your opinion, what do you see is this blacks wanting to hold on to whites? Because I listened to Tyreek, and you kept saying something that I was in agreement with. You said, hey, why don't we just let blacks have black stuff? We have our stuff. We'll even separate it somewhere. And he kept saying, we've already tried that. We've already tried that. That didn't work. You just bomb us. You just bomb us. And you were like, okay, that happened then. This is a new day. We're renegotiating this thing. And he just kept wanting to go back to that. Now, to give you something about Tyreek, his wife is a mixed Jew. She's a black woman mixed with Jewish. You see pictures of him with his mother-in-law, who's a white woman. He lives in a completely white neighborhood, brags about living in a completely white neighborhood. He talks trash to any black person who does not have the riches that he has. So while he gets on television saying whites won't allow blacks to become rich, he makes fun of blacks who aren't as rich as him. That's why I said I think he's a troll, because it doesn't make sense that this man can be pro-black and he goes home to a white Jewish mother-in-law. None of it makes sense. And I'm listening to him argue with you about how whites are so bad and have done things wrong to blacks. Yet when it came to the idea of you saying, you're right, let's separate, he wouldn't do it. What is contributing to that mentality of you guys are bad, but we want to stay with you?
You know, what that reminds me of is Louis Farrakhan. The Nation of Islam, in their periodical, their newspaper, it's called The Final Call, I believe. In the inside back page of every issue, if they're still publishing it that way, it lists the demands of the Nation of Islam. And one of the demands is separation. They say, how can the sons of the slave owner and the sons of the slave live in harmony together? And the whole idea of the Nation of Islam was to, in fact, create a nation, a separate society. And I think that that is something that is now just eyewash. I don't believe that the Nation of Islam, and I don't believe Louis Farrakhan, have their hearts in that idea. You remember the Million Man March? I can't remember, this is what, early 90s? How long do we have to go back to the Million Man March? This was the opportunity that Louis Farrakhan had to speak to not only the largest live audience in his life, but the largest televised audience. And I was thinking, okay, Louis, now is your chance. Now is your chance to lay out your plan. Well, He talked about the mothership floating around out there. He talked about numerology. He talks about all kind of crazy things. Of course, he talked about racist white people. Not one word about separation. Not one word. And I suspect, and I don't know if he'd ever admit it, I suspect that Louis Farrakhan has looked around the world. He's looked at Haiti. He's looked at Africa. He's looked at Black communities in various parts of the world. And maybe it's dawned on him that if Blacks are really separate, and if they have to take responsibility for their society, it's not going to be a pretty place. And that he and his Nation of Islam are much better living in the United States with enough white people to make sure the airplanes stay up in the air, to make sure the roads stay paved, to make sure the electricity comes in when it's supposed to come in. They're much better living in that society, but with these constant demands, constant prodding to the white man to keep us on the back foot, always apologizing, always making sure that we say, no, sorry, we can do better next time. That is my suspicion about Louis Farrakhan. Now, I do not want to impute motives because I've had so many base motives imputed to me. But at the same time, I just do not think that there are any Black people there are some that I've heard of. There are some that I'm aware of but there are very, very few Blacks who really want to have the responsibility of running the show completely and for all responsibility to fall on them. Yeah. Most of the time when I ever discuss this with Black people, they say, well, okay, you got to start us off with each $1 million or, well, wait a minute. Society doesn't work that way. You know, if you think that you are this great nation, that the wealth of the United States derives from the work of slaves, you have got to be productive enough to work things out for yourselves. I just don't think many Blacks are prepared to make that leap of faith, and it's faith in their own abilities, which I think if you look hard enough, it's just not there.
Okay, I got to ask you this then.
Yes, sir.
And then let's see what you walked me into it. So I got to ask.
All right.
Reparations.
Reparations. Yeah. Well, I would certainly agree that what was done to Blacks who were brought across the Atlantic and put into slavery, that was a terrible thing. It was a bad thing. Of course, it's not unique to white people. People all around the world have been enslaving folks. I don't want to make some sort of a special apology just because I'm white and just because you're Black. I think that's all baloney, and it makes me sick when white people go to Africa and chain themselves up and walk through the streets and say, I'm sorry. That just makes me absolutely sick. One way you could look at it is this. And you know the name Keith Richburg? Keith Richburg was, I think he was a Washington Times or a Washington Post or New York Times correspondent in Africa. And he was there for long enough to think that, man, we don't need reparations. We should be glad that our ancestors were enslaved. He saw the worst of Africa as a correspondent. And somebody once said to him, now, don't you feel angry that your ancestors were enslaved? He says, I'm grateful my ancestors were enslaved. Black people living in the United States today are vastly better off than Black people living practically anywhere in the world, certainly compared to where they were in Africa. And you know, Phyllis Wheatley, who said, slavery is the price my people paid for civilization. Now, that's taking it pretty far too, but that is one argument you can make. And it's an argument that I think has to be listened to, and it cannot be just dismissed completely. Keith Richburg and Phyllis Wheatley, they're coming at it from very different time periods, but I think they have a point. Now, in terms of, okay, let us assume that there were calculable wrongs done to Blacks. Well, how are you going to work this out? Theoretically, it's the government that's going to tax folks and then give money to Black people. Well, the U.S. government never owned a single slave. Are we going to tax everybody in the United States and give money to Black people? How are we going to figure out which Black people were descended from slaves? You know, there were about 3,000 Black people who owned slaves themselves. 1830 census, and by the time 1860, probably even more Black people who owned slaves. It's a very, very complicated accounting job. And there is no theory of criminal justice according to which, if it turns out that you murdered my grandpa, I have no claim on you. That's finished. I can go jump, I can go stomp. I'm sorry, your grandpa murdered my grandpa. Let's put it that way. Generations ago. I can go kick your grandpa's gravestone, but you don't owe me anything. And slavery is presumably, it's a bad thing, but it's not as bad as murder. And if my ancestor enslaved you, does that mean that you have some sort of monetary claim on me? There's very little in terms of any kind of theory of justice that would say that, yes, you do have a claim.
I think the problem is, though, if you're black, it's kind of like what you were saying when you, as a white person, can look around and see the stuff that everyone else is allowed to do, but you're not. And you're like, well, wait a minute, that's kind of weird. That's not justice. I think what happens with black people is they look around and they say, well, wait a minute, look what the Jews got. Look what the people who were in internment camps got. Look what the Indians got. But look what we were promised and never got. Why is it that everyone else receives something? And the reason the accounting job is so screwed up now is because when it was supposed to be done, it wasn't. It's kind of like if I was supposed to do my taxes this year and I waited 5 years, well, yes, the accounting is going to be screwed up. That's kind of on the United States' fault, right?
Well, I certainly understand that point of view. I think it was a big mistake to give money to the Japanese. I think that was completely wrong. As far as what's going on with the Indians, that is a complete mess too. And it's not as though Indians have been paid a kind of a monetary settlement. They've got these reservations, they got this free health care, they got education. All of that, it seems to me, really doesn't do them much good. They're worse off on the reservations than they are living in ordinary society. So I think that's sort of a bad model. The best model for your argument is what was done with the Japanese. And I think that was an absolutely terrible precedent. To tax people today for the alleged sins of the government of in the past, if you're really going to take that point of view, then you're going to say, okay, women couldn't get the vote until the 20th Amendment. Are we going to compensate all women living today because their ancestors were denied the vote? Or if we're going to say, okay, child labor was a bad, terrible thing, are we going to compensate all the descendants of people who did child labor? I just don't think that the present generation it's a very bad precedent to hold the present generation responsible for the wrongdoing of previous generations. As far as German reparations for Jews, I think if I were a German, I would resent that deeply too. I think these are very, very bad precedents. If you go back in history, you find all kinds of horrible things that one government has done to another government. I mean, if white people had this idea about slavery that we have inculcated into blacks, we'd be constantly reminding the Turks and the North Africans of how many white people were enslaved. I mean, they depopulated the coasts of Spain, of Italy. They went all the way out to Iceland, finding white people to enslave, to put to work in their galleys. If you're a galley slave, I'd much rather pick cotton than be a galley slave, let me tell you. And if we had this same sense of entitlement and victimhood, we'd be just ragging on about that till kingdom come. I think all of that kind of thinking is very unhealthy for present generations.
I'm in agreement with you, but I am one of those people who I will still speak on a fact. Like there's a fact that there are men who can have a sex change and turn into women. I would never be one. There's a fact that men are sleeping with other men. I would never do that, never advocate it, but it is a fact. It is a fact that blacks were promised before any of these other groups got something. They were the first to be promised something. They were the last to be given something. They still haven't been given anything.
The 40 acres and a mule, wasn't that some Army commander who just, Union Army general, I think, sort of had this idea? It was never an act of Congress. It was never an official promise of the United States government. I don't recall the details on that.
Well, it wasn't an official promise, but when you have a lot of people discussing what should we do for these people, and then at the end of the day, they say, nothing. But then everybody, you know what I'm saying? Like, but everybody else at least gets something. Like, I'm with you. A lot of the stuff didn't seem to help these people. It seemed to hinder them. But at the end of the day, what the Jews are getting didn't hinder them. They are having generations of money being flooded into their community based upon, look at what they did to Germany. Look at how Germany had to keep paying for stuff. And everybody in Germany didn't have anything to do with that, just like with slavery. What was it? I think it was only maybe 5% of whites actually owned slaves in the United States.
Yeah, 5% of Southern households only owned slaves. Only 1 in 20 Southern households owned slaves.
Right. I keep trying to explain to people it was an expensive proposition. It's the equivalent of if I had the money and I bought 25 cars. Like in my house the other day, I went and turned the water on. I haven't been in that side of the house in a while. The water was, it was spitting around. Like, you know, apparently I need to turn this water on every
Right.
now and again to keep it going. I was trying to explain to black people, you didn't just go get a slave like it was a now and later. That was something you spent a lot of money on, which in essence, you wouldn't just beat it and hang it every day or make it to
No.
where it couldn't work. And I'm not saying it was a great system and the people were treated well, but they surely weren't just beaten and killed every day, because that wouldn't make sense. You literally bought this person.
Right. Right. Well, Frederick Law Olmsted, he's the guy who laid out Central Park in New York. He took a tour of the antebellum South. And he had very, very interesting observations about slave society. He was sort of a typical white man of the time, and he was astonished at the kind of intimate relations between blacks and whites. Black mammies suckling white children. He thought this just was hair raising to him. And the kind of real closeness, sort of physical closeness that blacks and whites had, he couldn't make head nor tails of this. The other thing that he writes about is there was this very, very dangerous work of draining the swamps. And in Louisiana, in Louisiana, they had these malarial swamps with. They tried to get rid of that, and what they would do, they would hire these Irish navvies to do this very dangerous work. And he asked a white slave owner. He says, "Wait a minute. Why don't you have slaves do this kind of horrible work?" He says, "Whoa, no! A slave is a valuable commodity. You might die doing this kind of work. We don't want to waste our slaves on this." And this just made no sense to him either. Then there was also the view of some capitalists in the North who would go south and they would see slavery and they say, "This is the most inefficient thing I ever saw. You free these people. We'll bring them to our factories. We'll get 3 times the work out of them that you did." So the whole idea of slavery as having been this brutally exploitative institution, I'm sure in some cases it was. I'm sure, you see these photographs, these poor guys with, it looks like, just crisscrossed with lashings and scars. I'm sure that did happen. But my understanding is that for the most part, the idea of mistreating your people, as they were often called, was considered very low grade and infra-dig. And as you say, they're valuable property. You don't want to waste them draining malarial swamps. The whole question of slavery is a very complicated and vexed one. And I would never pretend to try to defend it. But if you look at the kind of ways people were treated in the mines back in the Pennsylvania anthracite coal mines, boy, oh boy, you might almost prefer being a slave working above ground and with some guy that's going to actually feed you until you die, keep you, the other thing that I always ask people, well, if slavery was so bad, why didn't the slave owners just kill the old slaves once they were too old to work? No, they kept them around, they kept them clothed and housed. I'm not trying to defend it as a good thing, but it was not this unmitigated horror of white people brutally and hatefully exploiting blacks. There's a story about Jefferson Davis. He was from Mississippi. And when he was tapped to be the president of the Confederate States of America, he went down to Montgomery, where it was the first Confederacy, the first capital of the Confederacy. When he took leave of his slaves, he didn't know when he was going to see them again. He wept, and his slaves wept. Now, that bespeaks a kind of affection, I'm sure it was a sort of paternal, in some cases condescending affection, but the idea that it was just nothing but white people wickedly and viciously abusing black people, that's baloney.
Because I compared it to how I address my cat, to be perfectly honest. My cat's living quite well. It's sitting there, but it is still a cat. I don't view it as a human, but there are people, animal lovers, who love their animals more than they love other humans. And I'm sure that there were plenty of slave owners, as you've read accounts of them, that preferred the company of their slaves than other people of the neighborhood or other people of the white community. So it does happen. And I'm with you. I would rather speak the truth of a situation and not add, yes, I would like it to go back that, or yes, I think it was a great thing. No, I just want to actually speak the truth of the situation too. So I have no problem with what you're saying. And as a matter of fact, I want to ask you this question. I've watched a few of your interviews. I've listened to them, and I've never seen you. You're not as offensive as, you're not as close to as offensive as I am. I'm a dick. I'm like, I just, but I don't understand.
You don't seem that way to me.
Well, I don't understand though,
Yes.
why we have the inability to have the discussion about things anymore. Because I think that's the most healthy and the most American thing we can do.